Much of Russian history was shaped by the imperial experience. Alexander Etkind suggests that the process was a simultaneous one of internal colonization as well as the more obvious external one. The characteristic phenomena of colonialism, such as missionary work, exotic journeys, and ethnographic scholarship, were directed inwards towards the interior provinces of the Russian Empire, villages and timeless peasant lifestyles, as well as the outwards and overseas studies. To an extent, Russia is still an undiscovered country from the perspective of its urban elites, and we see this starkly in the current war, with the burden of fighting and dying falling on minorities and the impoverished. We also see a radical lack of empathy for other people within the empire who are experiencing violence, whether they be in Belgorod or Buryatia. It even leads us to ask, can Russia even be compared to the modern nation states of Europe? Alexander Etkind is a historian and cultural scientist. He was born in 1955 in St. Petersburg, Russia, and is professor at CEU Vienna. He was formerly a professor of history and the chair of Russia-Europe relations at the European University Institute in Florence. He is fellow of the European Institute for International Law and International Relationships. Etkind's research focuses on European and Russian intellectual history, memory studies, natural resources, and the history of political economy, empire, and colonies in Europe. Now, he's also written some fantastic books. We will, of course, put descriptions to those in the videos, and I strongly recommend that you check them out. Alexander, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back for a second time to the channel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That's an honor.
Well, there was so much to unpack last time, and we're talking now in the context of some incredible changes. We've seen the insurgents, so-called insurgents, or little green men popping up in Belgorod and other border regions. And of course, we have seen Prigozhin's attempted coup or mutiny, or whatever label we want to put on it. It's perhaps not yet clear what that is. It leads me to ask, with all these incidents going on, as well as the drone attack over the Kremlin, has Russia actually got any borders anymore?
Borders. Well, there are fortifications, as we know very well, that basically cross now Donbass and Crimea and Belgorodskaya gubernia, which is internally internal Russia gubernia, but district. But that's the point, that whether it is internal or external, it is, these borders changed historically, and the political history of any country is about it. So many things, coups and wars of succession and whatever, but also about changing borders, either expansion outward or shrinking. Decrease are kind of going with being, so the borders either go forward or retreat, diminishing the space of the state. Of course, when we are talking about empires, and I believe that the Russian Federation is still an empire, so this question of moving borders is way more relevant than the borders of an established nation state, which respects the recognized borders of their neighbors.
And looking at the footage of Belgorod and others, I mean, there's a channel called 1420 where people are interviewed, on the streets of Russian provincial towns or Moscow, whatever, about what they think about various issues. And there seemed to be a stark, almost pathological lack of empathy for those people in Belgorod and other villages who were suffering violence, almost a sense that, well, that's a long way away, and it has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with my sort of understanding of the world locally. Is that something? I mean, that's just anecdotal, but does this process of internal colonization perhaps not engender empathy, or even limits this sense of Russia being a consistent nation state?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, when the events of genocide happened in Bucha and other places in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians and the whole world really was puzzled by the lack of empathy or protests in Russia, say in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And that was puzzling. But with these events in Belgorod, and it is anecdotal, but I think it's just a kind of premonition of things to come. We see that very similar attitude, differences in scale were huge, but the attitude was the same. Very same attitude the Muscovites they showed in response to the events and actual suffering, whatever murders of within the Russian borders. Yeah, that's internal colonization. So Moscow is very, very different from all the rest of Russia. And the farther it is, the bigger is the differences, but actually the differences, cultural differences, economic differences, political, etc. differences are huge. Also, if you go like 100 kilometers from Moscow, either you go north or south, east, west. Moscow is the center of exploitation, metropolitan center, center of culture, education, whatever, political governance, and everything else is, just the rest.
This process of internal colonization, does it also require other aspects of the nation state to be repressed? So this concept of having strong local identities, the concept of having, some kind of agency or control over not just national politics, but also local politics. And can that perhaps suppression of, I would say sort of normal political behaviors go in some part to explain this lack of empathy for those who are, not in your immediate vicinity or within, your local experience?
Yeah, exactly. It's like empathy goes together with actual interest, curiosity, respect to diversity, recognition of different bits and parts and pieces and peoples of the empire. And it's actually in many historical cases, the metropolitan people and institutions of the empire had developed this kind of interest, curiosity, actual research, precisely in the moment of decay, before the fall. So the development of this interest, geographic expeditions, ethnographic research, etc., signal the coming decay and fall of the empire. And I think in Russia it has not actually started. So we are looking at a kind of a long decay and a forthcoming end. But still there is a perception in the capitals, and the Russian schools at Moscow and St. Petersburg, two capitals, even though the major part of money and also personnel concentrated in Moscow. So from the perspective of Moscow, there is really kind of no diversity. There's huge space, the biggest country in the world, which includes Siberia and say the northern regions of the European Russia and southern Russia, where from which we're hearing the news. They are the so-called periphery, the so-called provinces, and they basically they are all the same.
And of course, it's easier in Britain, isn't it? We're surrounded by the sea. There's a natural constraint on those physical borders, at least of Britain. So I think we find it difficult to kind of understand that idea of a land empire that's a little amorphous, vast, and has actually grown over the centuries. This process of internal colonization, does it lead to a certain amount of confusion or lack of understanding amongst Russians about where their country begins and ends?
It is very complex, but history is complex of any country, any empire, to be sure. And say talking about Great Britain, you also have a Scottish border, you have borderlands, you had whatever Adrian Wall, and this border was a site of so many conflicts and attacks and movement, both ways, and with the current nationalist or separatist movement, however you call it, this border could be very relevant once again. And that's so you have, of course, Wales, and the very concept of internal colonization was created by a British sociologist, Michael Hector, who, in his book about Wales as an internal British colony, terrestrial colony. So, the British Empire had India and whatever, and 13 American colonies and much else. But it also had, and still have, Scotland and Wales, and Northern Ireland, which is separated, by a terrestrial border from Ireland. So, and this border right now is subject for very heated debates. So I don't think that it is so difficult for, say, a Brit to imagine the relevance of terrestrial borders. But indeed, high seas and all these oceans that separated, say, London and whatever, Calcutta, they kind of geopolitically, probably it's easier to grasp.
That was an extraordinary feature when traveling around Russia, because, if you go half an hour in any direction in Britain, accents change, building materials change, architectural styles change, local cultures, you get a lot of sort of local nuances of phraseology and so on. And that is in the modern age, which has seen a lot of systematization of cultures. If you were to go back, 80 years or so, 100 years in Britain, you'd have seen even greater diversity in these localities. Whereas traveling, say, from Moscow to Murmansk through to, right into Siberia, Irkutsk, and so on, which I did some time ago, I was struck by the fact that I could understand what people were saying, that there was relatively little variance in accents, very little variance actually in sort of architectural styles. You turn up in one town and it would have some features you hadn't seen somewhere else, but it was the consistency that was shocking, rather than the diversity.
Yeah, that's a very shocking experience. And there are also, shocking for visitors. It was also a puzzle for scholars. And there are many hypotheses or kind of theories why, say, there are the dialects in Russia or in the former Russian Empire had been kind of so weakly developed and were so kind of eagerly to vanish. So eager to vanish, it also goes to architectural style or the nature of local institutions. But what is, there are theories, but I believe that the overwhelming power of the central state is the explanation, and it is true now, and it was true also in the 19th century. All these towns, these cities like Irkutsk or whatever, Novosibirsk or Murmansk, they were largely created by the power of the central state. So the state sent its engineers, architects, soldiers. It's also the state which was located in the capital, St. Petersburg again, and Moscow, also absorbed the excessive labor from places like Siberia or southern Russia, and for creating factories, whatever, or supporting the growing bureaucracy in the center. So because of this overwhelming power of the state and weakness of what we would call nowadays civil society, but it's actually like local peoples, local dwellers. They could be ethnically the same as Russians or ethnically very different. It doesn't matter. They were very weak in comparison with this power of the state. And that created huge migration, huge sort of arrogance, I think, on the part of the center. And this is why there are no dialects.
And is this also a product of, we think of the central state being incredibly powerful, but actually is another interpretation to say that actually this need to control, this need to dominate actually comes from weakness, fragility, even paranoia. And we can relate that back to the current case. I mean, under Putin, you supposedly have an extraordinary centralization of power under a single autocrat. But the cracks that have been shown, in the last couple of weeks and months, especially by Prigozhin's mutiny, suggest that actually the center is not as all-powerful or in control. And what we're looking at is a sort of Potemkin facade, both in administrative terms, in terms of political ideology, in terms of the military, and we're now seeing real cracks in that fairly thin veneer.
Yeah, that's true. But there are cracks, which shows that this kind of state power is everything but flexible. There is no elasticity. It cannot bend. It cracks and breaks. It cannot really adjust to any kind of new circumstance. And history goes on. So in this condition, so all the power, this overwhelming power of the state, I believe in that. It's about economics. It's about the military power. It's about bureaucratic institutions. It's all concentrated in one place. And since they cannot bend, and they know it, they are trying to freeze the situation. They effectively freeze it. And so therefore, when it bends, it falls. There is sort of no shock absorbing mechanisms in this machine.
I always think of it in terms of a sort of fault line in an earthquake. If there's no give, you get one giant earthquake rather than a series of little sort of tremors and shocks. Is that what things are leading up to? Because I know the media loves to speculate about revolution in Russia. They love to speculate about Prigozhin. Was it a coup? Was it not? Who was involved, et cetera, et cetera. But do you think the cracks in the facade are big enough to actually bring it down? Because this empire has actually existed for a couple of 100 years, and despite all the sort of shocks, it does seem to have, generation after generation, found a way to continue. One could even say the Soviet Union was, a way, they found a method to continue, that imperial expansion, albeit in a way that was superficially progressive by, adopting sort of socialist principles, etc. Is there any more adaptability, or is this system reaching the end of its life?
Look, one could say that it is one continuous empire, whatever, from Ivan Grozny to Putin, through the Russian Empire, through the Soviet Union, through the Russian Federation. But don't forget, there were times of trouble in the 17th century, huge, very long and very painful period. Like the population of Moscow halved. There was a revolution of 1917, revolution, several major events, global sort of cataclysms, earthquakes, political earthquakes of global scale, and then there was terror, decades of terror, dozens of millions of people were killed. And then it kind of returned to some kind of alleged normality in the late 20th century. But then there was another revolution in 1991, kind of another cataclysm. So, and the very character, deep character of the state changed. Yes, there was continuity, but there were huge disruptions, explosions, really, political explosions every time. And I'm positive that we are looking at the start of it. So Prigozhin's mutiny, I think that was mutiny, and this is how it is actually called in Russia nowadays. But even though there are rumors that calling it, using the word mutiny for this Prigozhin march across European Russia would be criminalized. Like it would be like equal to the whatever defamation. But mutiny or rebellion, and it did happen. It happened. It ended much earlier than anybody could predict. But nobody also could predict that it would happen. But CIA now says that they predicted, but didn't communicate it, which was interesting because, like, if they couldn't communicate it then, why they can communicate it now? There are the same sources that they they reveal. But these events are truly unpredictable. That Prigozhin mutiny was shocking in its scale and determination, and then it was also equally shocking that it stopped. Obviously, despite the CIA and other sources of information, we still do not know about the undercover deals and whatever mafia-like negotiations that happened. They happened by telephone, or that they belong to this kind of oral culture, which is very easy to distort or just to forget this kind of things, to mythologize. But I'm positive that we will learn more, eventually with time. And historians will be happy to working on these events. But in these future books to be written about this, it will be just the first chapter, and there will be many chapters that will show the continuity, the kind of progress of this kind of events in the nearest future from us.
It's difficult, isn't it, to say anything with certainty? And I think, obviously as academics, you have to be incredibly cautious. The media aren't always quite so cautious, but there are a number of things I think we can possibly discuss and say with a degree of certainty. One is that Putin seems to have emerged from this weaker, with his image as a strongman challenged. Even his most ardent supporters seem to now be potentially starting to imagine a future without him, whereas a year ago, people wouldn't even have perhaps gone there. The other aspect, I think, more important for international partners, or former international partners, is that this whole lie that Russia somehow has, a constitutional system, we might not like it, etc., but it has rules, it has, some kind of basis in law, that seems to have been blown apart by someone, committing treason of the worst type, being forgiven on the fly ad hoc with no parliament, no judiciary involved. And then, I think it was today or yesterday, Putin has announced that actually Wagner was fully funded by the state. So how dare he, when in fact Wagner is illegal under the constitution, and there have been vociferous denials and even court cases. I think one, Benedictov, I think, lost a court case where the state and Prigozhin were even associated with Wagner. So it just blows out this idea that there is any rule of law, and exposes this system, which is very much based on informal personal relationships.
Well, we knew all that. I mean, really, who does that? But having it in the open and on the scale, of course, the scale of things is important. It's not just that that the state financed Prigozhin and his troops. It financed it on a huge scale. Many billions of dollars were spent, and partially, wasted, partially whatever invested, partially went for food and catering and shooting and killing. But it's a huge money. The estimates go to like 10 billions. And they were not taxed. They were, so Prigozhin kept them in cash, and he said that every payment that I did in cash. Of course, I had all this, lorries of cash. I mean, it's all criminal activity, from whatever, from the bottom to the roof. It is criminal. It's been accepted, but it doesn't mean that Prigozhin has been pardoned in any kind of juridical sense. Like if we, learn tomorrow that he fell out from the window or was poisoned or whatever, nobody would be really surprised. It will be just continuation of the same story.
And another aspect that is quite incredible, at least to me, is that Lukashenko should provide a, inverted commas, safe haven for Prigozhin and the Wagnerites. And there is apparently some footage of a military camp being repurposed for up to 20,000, or we don't know whether there's nearly that many soldiers that have followed Prigozhin. This is extraordinary in itself, and it begs the question as to whether Lukashenko has actually enhanced his position. Certainly vis-a-vis Putin, he's done a big favor, potentially, for the president of Russia. Has he also gained himself a krysha? Has he gained himself a sort of, bodyguards or protection that perhaps he could use against Putin in some sense?
Yeah, like if to believe that that was really a true mutiny against Putin, then Lukashenko gets really good bodyguards for in a possible conflict. But that was not a mutiny against Putin. That was like a mutiny that was a sort of a march for the better Putin, and he kind of refused to improve, and that was the reason why Prigozhin was so kind of disenchanted and turned his troops not really back, but like to different direction to Belarus. Of course, it raises question like, is Belarus really truly a different country? It's like this kind of medieval wars in which mercenaries have this freedom of going, from one country, from one master who paid well but stopped paying, to another master who promises this payment. Like it's like really comes out from Machiavelli, though Machiavelli, of course, was very much against mercenaries. He told the prince not to trust them because they can do any time exactly what Prigozhin is doing.
Yes, that's. I suspect that Putin may not have be deeply grounded in medieval Italian politics, as the mistakes he seems to be making. Now, when did this sort of internal colonization, which we're still seeing sort of play out, when did that really begin? Do we have to go back to sort of Petrine times, Peter the Great, or does it go much further back than that?
It does go further back, but once again, this process of on the firm land, this process of external expansion and internal colonization deeply connected. But of course, the external expansion comes first, and then this land is taken by the Cossacks or by the soldiers, whatever, and then it has to be colonized, really. And the first decision, the first decision was just to take the land that would be available. And then the second decision was like, what do we do with it? Like, why do we need it? What is good there that we could whatever take from there and sell somewhere else? That's called economic exploitation. And every colony, whether it's overseas colony or terrestrial colony, is about a particular natural resource, or that would be valuable enough for being taken and sold or processed, and then the results of this industrial process, act would be sold as commodity elsewhere. And this is how empires work, really. So and in this huge expanse, between Moscow and Siberia, that was really a pretty long story. It's the only valuable natural resource that Russia could actually sell to its to the Western partners was fur, and say the Novgorod principality, the first kind of organized state, was exporting squirrel furs in huge numbers, millions of squirrel furs a year. And it was exporting the same direction to Germany, to the Low Countries, to England. And then the West, mainly because there was wool available. When the wool became available in big quantities, then the Western Europe lost its interest in squirrels, because wool was whatever better, lighter, etc., and warmer. And but then during the Czarship of Ivan the Terrible, the Russians found sable in Siberia, and sable had no competition. It was like diamonds nowadays, and it was easy to export, kind of light. They don't, I mean, if they don't rot, etc. This pelts, and therefore Siberia was taken. All this expansion through Siberia was done for the sake of sable, but then sable was also exhausted, like unlike many other natural resources, like the squirrel. Squirrel was still there, but there was no demand. But sable was actually done, exterminated, and the Muscovite state lost its source of income, and decades passed, and the time of troubles started in Russia, and that was like a foreign invasion. The Poles came, the Cossacks came from the contemporary Ukraine. They occupied Moscow. Several impostors. The British, the British king, English king actually, developed a quite advanced plan of colonizing northern Russia through the White Sea, because there was already the export of hemp that England really needed for the navy, and the time of trouble stopped those sort of trade routes. That also didn't happen for a number of reasons. But this time of troubles is a kind of was a formative experience. So the new dynasty emerged, the Romanovs emerged in the end of this time of troubles. And every time that another revolution or political crisis emerge in Russia, people are talking about that time of troubles. So like every empire goes through this sort of changes of its deep economic and political structures from one change to another. Say the British Empire underwent this change from, say, importing sugar or trading in sugar to trading in cotton, and that was a major kind of source of turbulence. And in Russia, all these changes, they are compared to the times of trouble. And it was interesting to see that during this Prigozhin mutiny, people started to talk about the time of troubles once again.
And clearly there are memories like this. I mean, not direct memories, but time of troubles must be given Putin some sort of degree of paranoia. But also, more recently, the revolution of 100 years ago, the 1917 revolution, he seems to have a particularly complicated relationship with that. And much more recently, what happened to Gaddafi. He does seem to have this image of, Gaddafi being murdered in a ditch. And these things must sit heavily on his mind.
Well, they do, and he often emphasized his historical erudition and kind of interest in history. It's never clear, has he actually read whatever and what kind of historical books he reads. It does look like, for instance, that he's interested in biographies. This is something else that triggers his imagination. But the gruesome end, I mean, the murder of the Tsar family, they were like along with daughters and and doctors and the valets, they were just murdered, and bodies were thrown into a mine. They were not properly buried, etc. And they were exhumed, and all kinds of political debates took part about these remains, and Putin had to make certain decisions about these remains. So I think that if he really thinks about his end, he thinks about it. He doesn't think about Gaddafi. He thinks about Nicholas II.
And coming back to the idea of the sort of expropriation of resources, the expanding empire, the changing territories of the empire driven by resources, materials to power a centralized regime, that is not too dissimilar from the oil, the gas, the hydrocarbons that we see that have delivered really what was a period of sort of 15 or so years of relative stability from 2000 onwards. That, of course, is being shaken up now. So that's one aspect of it. But another aspect, going back to what you said about the sort of the Muscovy Empire sort of expanding along trade routes, there's another parallel process, isn't there? Or perhaps it comes with a delay. And that is when the elite acquires money, they seek to use that money to acquire respectability. And we know that European culture, European literature was grafted on, European, architecture, construction styles were grafted on, often to the detriment of what perhaps was local and what went before. I'd love to hear your views on the role of sort of acquiring culture, art, etc., along with the acquisition of resources, materials, trade routes, etc.
Wow, that's a deep question. So that's an important process, and this extractive economy really brings a lot of money in the hands of the head of the state. But then how he uses this money is a different question. It depends on the taste and sort of his or her personal kind of culture. So say Catherine II had a highly advanced European taste. So she was German, from one of northern German principalities. And she saw St. Petersburg and certain villages around Petersburg as her home. So she built palaces. She invited really best architects of Europe, Italians, whatever, French, to build fantastic palaces and museums. And she bought up, the valuable objects, whatever, canvases or engraved stones or whatever from, all over Europe, to keep it in the Hermitage. So what happened? So sables or some other, like whatever, foxes, etc. That was still, so that was grain and fur, but grain came to the state, but the profits from sable or from fur trade still, even at the time of Catherine II, still came to her personal personal chancellery. That was her, like her personal money. So this fur would be sold in Europe, and then in exchange, Rembrandt or whatever, Raphael would come to the Hermitage. Let's say Putin's power is different. So the oil and gas comes basically from the same places from where sable came from, West Siberia. To the same places, you know. So when I was writing this internal colonization book, I was struck by the fact that the trade routes were very much the same. There is no more different things like than say fur and oil, but they went from Siberia to West Russia through the same kind of rivers, canals, and the Baltic. Then and now, but then the money goes back, but not to West Siberia, but go back to the Russian capitals. Then it was St. Petersburg, now it's Moscow. Now, how to spend this money? So Catherine, whatever, invested in art collections. She invited French philosophers. Diderot came, and you know, she actually paid pensions, you know, to Voltaire and whatever. It would be like as if like Putin say paid pension to Derrida. That's kind of entirely impossible to imagine this. You know? So that really depends on taste of the ruler. So this solution, but still, what to do with this money? Of course, a big chunk went to, now we know how much went to, say, Prigozhin and his business. A big chunk of this money went to the Minister of Defense, you know, for the armaments, etc. But Putin's and his elite solution was exactly different from Catherine's. Putin's solution is called capital flight. So they brought this money, and because it's insecure in Russia, it's unstable, and it's not cozy maybe for someone, and there is no good whatever parks or universities or hospitals for the families of these people. So they exported this money legally or illegally. They smuggled these billions and billions. They come to $1 trillion during the Putin's years to Western Europe and North America. So they bought yachts, they built palaces, villas, whatever. Invested, of course, in various stocks and banks. And it's interesting to look, you know, like everyone, of course, who comes to Russia goes to the Hermitage, and he knows, you know, what Catherine bought for her money. But what Putin buys for his money is less known. Like we know much of it from Alexei Navalny's shows. In my book, I spent some time just exploring, just using internet for investigating Putin's yachts. Sechin yachts, you know, Abramovich yacht, what kind of yachts. You know. That was an interesting exercise. I sort of collected this information just to understand the scale of this theft.
And when that culture is grafted on, as it was over hundreds of years, does that sort of have an influence on, I would say, the inheritability of that or the innovation? I mean, a really sort of weird analogy would be, someone who's made their new money in Britain, they go out and buy the best sofa money can buy, and then they keep the plastic on it, and you can't sit on it and enjoy it because, it's a status symbol. It's not something you actually enjoy and really incorporate into your imagination and your life. Is there an aspect of why we see, let's say in the revolution, so much of Russian culture and art and innovation gets sort of stifled, destroyed, lost every time there's one of these seismic sort of political changes? There's a problem not just in political succession, but there seems to be a problem in cultural inheritability, or inheriting the ability to innovate through these different sort of generations of power shifts.
Right. I summarize these concepts in the idea of taste. Your example with sofa is a good one, because it's like there is this kind of old idea that the nouveau riche, the new rich, they don't have good taste. It takes generations to develop proper taste, which of course, there are so many exceptions from this rule, etc. And Russians, before the revolution, after the revolution, they actually were leading in cultural innovation, modernism, modern art, visual art, ballet, Diaghilev's ballet.
Culinary art as well, little known, but Moscow restaurant culture of the the early part of the 20th century was incredibly vibrant.
Also interesting, yeah, and but also there are studies that show that say that some of the first black jazz performers, they came to Moscow, Petersburg to perform. So it was actually a very sensitive. That was good taste, sensitive, creative, hospitable to innovation, and also. The same goes to the antiques. So the Russian collectors, from Catherine to great 19th century collectors, Tretьяков, etc. So they actually helped preserve world culture on a big scale. But with this new Russian elite, that's something different. We like from Navalny, we saw this, pathetic architecture of Putin's palace. From the news, I learned quite recently, actually, it happened that the Italian architect who built that palace and 40 other palaces around Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, he was arrested recently by the Italian Carabinieri and for tax evasion, and he had his own palace somewhere near Brescia and helicopters, etc. So there are interesting kind of speculations, interesting research being done on this taste of the new rulers, and it's not only Russian problem. Like when Yanukovych, the Ukrainian leader, fled from Russia, so people actually broke into his palace, and many photos was he actually lived there. Putin didn't live in that palace. Still, we have some photos from the Kremlin, very bad taste. So why and what are the cultural? Is it whatever? Is it Barocco or is it Rococo? Is it like the Italian legacy? So it looks like more like the Habsburgs, Where did it come from? Or maybe like Putin was so impressed by the Ekaterinian palace, Catherine the Great palaces, that he visited like in a Leningrad school child for excursions, and there is a lot of kind of rococo there. But there is this issue of taste, which is kind of interesting, and it's not only Russian problem. I think, like when we saw the Trump Tower, for instance, when we saw some other international oligarchs, how they live, what they do with their money. That's pretty much Berlusconi, of course, was a big teacher of Putin in various matters of television, matters of political propaganda. And I guess matters of taste in general.
Well, let's turn in the sort of as we're approaching the sort of final question or questions. Let's turn to this concept of internal colonization, because through big chunks of Russian history, that was a process taking place in the context of expansion, expanding borders of the empire. And you could include the acquisition of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, but also the territories of Finland and so on that were required and still form part of Russia's territory. As we're entering this period of instability, how do you think internal colonization could go into reverse? And how could a process of decolonization take place, given the context of how that empire was built up and how brittle its centralized system appears to be?
Yeah, we should go basically around the map of the Russian Federation and look at its borders and also at its internal parts. So the internal colonization is, is one thing, but there's sort of, let's say the Chinese call 100 years of shame. It's different historical memories about the Russian Empire, imperial appropriations or the Soviet appropriations of certain lands. Some of these lands, many of these lands, foreign lands, were emancipated themselves in 1991, but not all of them. You mentioned, say, the Gulf of Finland territory, which was taken after the Finnish War, after the World War II. It was internationally recognized, but say I grew up there in this to the north from Leningrad in the dacha places and visited them many times. So I had my own dacha somewhere there. On the Lake of Ladoga, and I saw, it's called nostalgic tourism. So Finnish buses come and old ladies or gentlemen, they come and trying to find that well or that fireplace that they remember. Everything has changed, but they do find. Or going back to the Chinese border, there was a huge territory that was taken as by the Russian Empire as the result of the Second Opium War, which the British Empire waged against China shamefully. And the Russians actually mediated the conflict and kind of helped to find a diplomatic solution. There's huge territories on the Amur River and all the way to Vladivostok that were taken by the Russian Empire after the Second Opium War. And the war was waged by the British and French empires, but the Russians helped to negotiate the peace. And in the process of this negotiation, they actually got a huge chunk of land called Outer Manchuria. And now it's basically southern Siberia. Chinese have their own historical memories. So when I imagine how Putin shares his historical grievances with President Xi, I call it this Donbass. It used to be ours, now it's not ours. We want it back. So President Xi, with his smile, he kind of he has his thoughts and about the Second Opium War, Outer Manchuria, and all this natural resources, from timber to oil, etc., that to rare metals that still not used on that underpopulated territory. So one process that we could imagine, and it has something to do with internal colonization, but it's more like a legacy of external colonization, of just imperial expansion, of the proper imperialism. Looking outside, and now these territories are within the Russian Federation, and on the borders, when the central power will kind of be weakening, these borders will crumble. And of course, that's already a serious challenge, because, say, there were dozens of thousands of Russian troops along the Chinese border. They were well equipped with all amenities. Soviet-made military bases and all that. And now all these tanks and personal, they are in Ukraine. So the Chinese border is not protected, and President Xi knows it very well, better than anybody else. And what he will do with this, would he prefer sort of peaceful migration and agricultural development? So much of this farmland, is being developed in southern Siberia by the Chinese already. But it is, partially legally, partially illegally, nobody notices. Or he would prefer something more radical. What, say, the Finnish people would want. There were many polls in which the people of Finland, they said, no, we don't need this, lands back. They used to be beautiful. Viborg was the second city of Finland, the most beautiful one, etc. But it's now so much destroyed and spoiled, we don't want it back. But of course, the Finnish people are free to change their mind at the time. So that's one process exactly on the periphery, in the borderlands of the Russian Federation. But there are also interesting processes within the Federation, because there are big lands, potential countries such as Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and many others, places in the Urals and Siberia, and of course in the Caucasus and southern Russia, that could also claim their independence whenever the central power would feel sick.
Well, the last question really is around change, and actually sort of sustainable democratic change, which may seem to be sort of wishful thinking for now, but in talking to a lot of people who were activated by Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, who've been involved with the development of civil society in Ukraine, I think one of the lesser appreciated aspects is that actually having a sense of location, having agency control over your locality, your town, your region, and your immediate life has been actually an important part. Now, that ladders up to the revolutions they've had, but actually it's that emergence of local power bases and local civil society that's been a key feature of why these changes have actually been sustainable and as robust as they are. This sort of, to me at least, implies that if Russia is to progress and move forward, then some significant fragmentation of central power needs to happen, and local, regional, city-based power structures, genuine power structures, need to emerge that are locally accountable. Even for that process to begin, I'm not saying it will come into existence, momentarily. It'll take decades, but that is perhaps the starting point. How on earth is that going to happen?
I think actually that this is already happening, and that actually happened right after 1991. That's Tatarstan proclaimed its sovereignty, and Yeltsin's government accepted that and negotiated some kind of mutually beneficial whatever conditions. There was a constitution, and then Putin came to power and changed that constitution and deprived Tatarstan of its sovereignty, whatever it meant at that point. And then there are, all kinds of issues with, say, language training, Tatar language in the schools. Say the University of Tatarstan, or the University of Kazan, is well known for its kind of serious nationalist movement among the students, even among the professors. In the Komi Republic, there are, that's the European north of Russia. There were particular situation like they have their own nationalist movements. In the Udmurtia, their own professor of the local university in Izhevsk committed suicide, burned himself in protest against the sort of discrimination of the local Udmurt language. And there are cases and cases, but of course it's all kind of pales in comparison to the current war. But still, the successes of Ukraine, I'm sure, will sort of will be used as models by many other separatist nationalist movements around the federation that will start to be more kind of will start to unfold, to be clear, to be visible for us. There are basically two projects of for a good Russia, for post-Putin's Russia, kind of that how it could develop positively. There are also many projects, many fears of what could happen if of a negative range. But for a positive development, there are two projects. One is this sort of fragmentation and understanding that different parts, each successor state will have its own political system. There was, democracy in one place, theocracy in another place, whatever. Maybe joining the neighbor for someone else, economic dependencies, etc. But the space is huge, and yes, there will be this kind of centripetal development, like every part will be developing in a different direction, and they will still have to deal with one another. There will be trade routes, whatever, political coalitions, we don't know all that. But I think that's a very positive and kind of very optimistic scenario, but also all this variety will have to be accepted, recognized by the global community. That's crucial for the success of this long-term progress. But another and competitive project, and much of the Russian opposition, anti-Putin opposition, actually shares this particular project, is that okay, so there will be kind of democratic development within the current Russian borders. So the bad government should be changed, onto a good government, and all this really bad, fictional democracy will be changed into a true democracy. But it will still, should happen, will happen within the current boundaries. And that would be fantastic if it, and I'm sure that, the American friends of Russia and the European friends, and even I think some Ukrainian enemies of the Russian Federation, they would prefer this scenario for various reasons. But I look at this very skeptically, because it is exactly this sort of imperialism, internal imperialism of the Russian Federation that has already killed its democratic development. So there were, through the 90s, there were lots of positive changes and processes. But then the Chechen War started. One Chechen War, second Chechen War. Putin came to power for running these wars. And, we know very well what happened next. So if this democratic development, one of the goals, or maybe the high principle of this democratic development will be keeping Russia united, running it as the United Russia. United Russia is the ruling party of the Putin's regime. They have no other political ideas or ideals but United Russia. So this would be a very, very bad thing to inherit. And it will kill the Russian democracy. Imperialism would kill Russian democracy once again.
Yeah, even if there's a couple of years of stability, it's almost like the one is an oxymoron. The one sort of cancels out the other. That's absolutely fascinating, Alexander. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you about these incredibly complex issues, and I'm sure the coming weeks and months will play out in a variety of actually quite unpredictable ways.
Exactly. Well, looking forward to to seeing all this happening, and maybe we will discuss it once again.